added pressure. Well, look, hello everybody. It's lovely to see you all here tonight. I am Helen Perry, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the Causeway Coast and Glens Borough Council Museum Services Development Manager, which means I look after all the museums, the collections and the services that are run through council. Nick works with me, he's one of my team. You'll be meeting Sarah, who's another one of the team, next week. But we're absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to share some of our history with people like yourselves. You can probably gather I'm not from here either, and part of my fascination with the 17th century plantation in Ulster, particularly the Causeway area, is just that, I suppose, coming from Australia and also spending some time in New Zealand, that colonial past that impacts on our contemporary society does fascinate me. So about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to start exploring this area and in more detail in terms of this plantation history, because there were big anniversaries coming up, that being 400 years since the anniversary of the town charters. So can I just ask a quick question here? Does anybody here live in Port Stewart? Oh, you're all on mute, aren't you?
Yeah, no.
Okay, that's all right. That's a badly thought out question then. It's probably, I really just wanted to point out the slight anomaly that if you live in Port Stewart, you're part of County Londonderry, whereas in fact, at once upon a time, you would have been in County Antrim. And tonight's talk will sort of reveal some of the sort of explanation for some of the things that still go on today. I had another question about fishing in rivers. Did you know that if you wanted to go fishing in the rivers, particularly the River Bann and its tributaries, the license for you to do that fishing actually comes through the agents of an organisation called the Irish Society, and you will be hearing a bit about them if you don't know them. I'm just going to, the other thing is if you're walking around the centre of Coleraine, you will see these plaques around the town. And tonight we're just going to be talking about why you see plaques around the town of Coleraine with the word London or reference to London in them, and why you see references to things like the George Cross, and some of the crests that you see actually have the crests of the City of London. 400 years ago, life here was absolutely transformed. New laws came in, new religion, new landlords, new towns and new money. And the legacy of those changes at that time contribute to the tensions in our community today, but also underpins our very own council, our civic governance, if you like. And this is because for some people out there, they understand their ancestors were kicked out, robbed of their land, denied their way of life, or killed. For other people here, they understand their ancestors brought stability, education, prosperity and other benefits to a very wild and unruly place. And certainly when I first came here, there was a sort of a tendency to say that the history of Coleraine in particular, I only started in the 17th century at Mount Sandal, and thank goodness the Friends of Mount Sandal Discovery Group have been doing a lot of work to just remind people that actually Irish history started here 10,000 years ago. And I know that Nick has been talking to you about some of the earlier history. So what is this all about? This is only an introduction to a very complex and contested history. And I'm coming at this from a sort of public history approach. And this means I'm gathering together multiple strands from history, archaeology, and memory. There are multiple and sometimes contradictory perspectives. And in providing this introduction, I may at times oversimplify just to get points across, when in fact there is a much deeper history, but we don't have time tonight. And if you're interested, I can either talk to you later, or I can provide you with a list of people and places to go to for further information. But certainly over the last 10, it's probably even slightly longer than that, we have been fortunate enough to work with some terrific archaeologists. And this is how we do know, or start to know, what went on in the Causeway area in the 17th century. There certainly has been a lot of work focusing on the Derry-Londonderry history. Coleraine, Limavady and the rest of the county have a lot to do to catch up. And County Antrim, where we're interested in the McDonald's territory, is less well, it's partly well known. That's thanks to the likes of Colin Breen and Jane Olmeyer. But for tonight's talk, you'll hear me referencing the archaeologists like Nick Brannan, who did a lot of work in Coleraine and also did a lot of work in Dungiven, really redefining our understanding of the 17th century history in those areas. We have Dr. Colin Breen, whose work at Dunluce and Ballylough, and more recently, he's got his eye on Ballycastle. And then Professor Audrey Horning, who has dug Movanagher. She's dug the Roe Valley Phillips property and over in Goodlands. And I have a feeling I've left out some of Audrey's work because she has done an awful lot of work, particularly exploring the sort of connections and the sort of comparisons with the states, particularly around in Virginia. Thanks to this process of plantation, and I will be going into this in a bit more detail, we have some extraordinary archives. They're held in the London Metropolitan Archives. There's something like 145 linear metres of archives belonging to the Irish Society. On top of that, we have the Livery Company themselves, and again, I'll explain a bit more about them. Places like the Lambeth Palace Library and Public Records Office here. There are some artefacts, and of course we have the archaeology, but we actually have some artefacts that have survived and been in use since that period, and we have a couple of those in Coleraines' collection, and St Patrick's Church Coleraine also has a rather lovely chalice from 1613. But it is
Helen, sorry,
yeah.
I interrupt you there. Do you have slides that you're sharing?
They're coming,
Because,
Nick.
Yep, okay, sorry.
Yep. It's the regular reports relating to County Londonderry going back to London, which provide us with this extraordinary rich seam of archaeological history. The County Antrim archives aren't so extensive, so perhaps we rely more heavily on the archaeology there. There you go, Nick. Found you some artifacts. Coleraines' sword is one of those items. It was presented to Coleraine in 1616. It has never been used in battle. It is purely a ceremonial sword. We do use it in some of our curatorial collections, handling sessions, where we get people sort of considering what that sword, we treat it as a mystery object, and some of the stories are quite fascinating. There is that chalice that was presented by the Honourable the Irish Society to St Patrick's Church. And I'll mention this is a piece of Nick's, a piece of timber from a site that Nick was digging in Coleraine in the 1980s, which really challenged perceptions of our history. The archaeology was rewritten as a result of that piece of timber, which...
Helen,
yeah?
sorry to interrupt you. I can't see your slides. I'm not sure if everybody else is seeing the slides.
No.
No, we're just not seeing your slides at the minute, Helen.
Oh, are you seeing this next one?
So unless you just hit share screen and try again to share them, Helen.
Yeah.
It's maybe just not worked the first time, sorry.
You're not seeing any of my slides?
No.
Sorry, Helen.
The joys of Zoom. We'll get it sorted.
Sorry, so that's why you were interrupting me, Nick, because I'm just going to go out. Try share screen. Sorry, folks.
It's okay, Helen. There we go. That's
You
you
can see
now.
that. Okay.
Yep, that's working now.
That's perfect.
Right, I may leave the slides running down the side because I think when I hit the, let me just see, can you still see it? Or is that
Yes.
disappeared? You
Yeah.
can see it.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's great.
terrific. Okay, thanks. Apologies for that. I was just talking there about the artifacts. You've got Coleraines' sword from 1616 that was presented to what was then the Corporation of Coleraine. And this is this gorgeous chalice that's in St Patrick's Church, dating from 1613, presented by the City of London companies to St Patrick's. And I'm sorry, I've got a playful cat who's decided that he doesn't like, she'd rather I talk to her than to you. So if there's a bit of crashing in the background, forgive me. What you're seeing there is when Nick was digging Coleraine, it was whilst a building was being demolished in part of the Moors complex, and he found the remains of a piece of timber that they were able to date, and it was the early 17th century. And up until Nick had dug this site and found this piece of timber, they had thought that the buildings in Coleraine from this period, the timber frames had come from London. What Nick was able to establish by identifying timbers here was that these in fact came from the forests up the Bann River. And they were actually, why would you be bringing timber over from London when in fact you had great forests available to you on your doorstep? So just a couple of explanations before I go into this in more detail. And please, somebody shout if these screens stop sharing. It's a word quite often that refers to a single estate with a single cash crop or monoculture, such as sugar, tobacco, and forestry. But in this context, the word plantation is used as a process of controlling a territory, protecting or opening up trade routes. It was for economic reasons through the settlement of emigrants. In Ireland, this process was in the context of the European colonial expansion westwards in particular, and eastwards by those great colonial empires, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Britain, and France. And there are some shared narratives, going into an empty space, and if anybody was there, they were savages. The plantations at the time, we'd already had a 16th century plantation in Munster, and then Queen and Kings County in what is now the south, in County Laois and County Offaly, as they are now called since partition 100 years ago. We had Hamilton and Montgomery with their private plantation in County Down, and then we have the Virginia plantation in Jamestown and a Newfoundland plantation. So the plantation in our area wasn't exceptional. You also had McDonald planting County Antrim at the same time as County Londonderry. When I refer to James throughout this talk, I'm talking about James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England as well, as the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic. And this was when Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. James, however, had been brought up a Protestant in Scotland. You'll hear me talk about the Honourable the Irish Society, and we certainly know them today as the Irish Society. With some of the documents, we see words like escheated lands, is how I would pronounce it. It's basically lands that were forfeited to the Crown. We also refer to the proportion of land. You'll see it on some of the maps I'm going to show you. It just means they were the company lands in County Londonderry. So it was the land holding, if you like. I just wanted to show you this map, and it's one I can thank Colin Breen for. It's 1595. It's actually come from the National Maritime Museum over in London, but it just gives you a bit of a sense of how things was viewed. It was a slightly different view of the world than we might normally see. You've got places like Kintyre. Sorry about that, clicked too enthusiastically. You've got Kintyre here, you've got Islay there, and look at the, I think one of the things that intrigues me is the fact that you look at Rathlin, which appears to be the centre of the universe, and the scale of it compared to the rest, certainly of our area, is considerable. But it's really just to remind ourselves that this, the maritime route, this was a serious trading route. You might hear it referred to as a maritime superhighway. This is how goods and people travel between Britain and America. And it was basically, they were used coming around this coastline and would go up the River Bann into Loch Ness. And it's got all sorts of lovely illustrations on it. So just from a sort of visual interest, it's rather lovely. And you can see the ships and the fish and the sea gods. Nick, your talk last week. So 16th century Ireland had been ruled by the Irish clans. You had the MacDonalds, the McQuillans and O'Cahon in the areas that are now Causeway Coast and Glens Borough Council, because that's the area we're focusing on tonight. And you had the Lord O'Neill down in Tyrone. We'd been going through a period of what was called the 9 Years' War, which ended in 1603 when Lord O'Neill surrenders to a portrait of Queen Elizabeth, it said, and I was, because she had just died, but they wanted to make sure he surrendered. The countryside had been burned, population was starving, buildings had been destroyed, but the powerful clans in Ireland had been defeated, and England starts to gain control of all of Ireland. Coleraine and Derry at that time were considered ruined cities. Sir Thomas Phillips would refer to them as ruined cities. As I said, in 1603, O'Neill surrenders. This coincides with James VI of Scotland becoming James I of England. He grants MacDonald over 330,000 acres of land in County Antrim. 1604, Sir Thomas Phillips would be buying Coleraine, the old abbey, and he would move in there and start work. In 1607, you have the flight of the Earls to Europe, and at the same time, you have the Virginia colony being planted at Jamestown. Already by 1608, you have MacDonald building his town and manor house at Dunluce, and the first license to distill whiskey. I know for a long time Bushmills were saying that they got the first license in 1608, but in actual fact, I've noticed they've rephrased that. It was actually granted to Sir Thomas Phillips, for anybody who likes their whiskey. But in 1609, the Articles of Plantation were agreed between the Privy Council and the City of London. I will come back to this in more detail. This slide is one that BBC History had done on the 1609 plantation, and it's really to just indicate the kind of wider context of the plantation, that you have what are called the sort of not part of this County Antrim and County Down weren't part of the official plantation, but they were being planted. And of course we have MacDonald up in the north of Antrim, we have Chichester around Carrickfergus and Belfast, we have Hamilton and Montgomery over on the Ards Peninsula, but the Londonderry plantation was different to all the others. You have holdings assigned to Scottish undertakers, English undertakers, and then where it says assigned to this pale green, it's ex-military men who'd served the crown, or it was what they called the deserving Irish. You see there the yellow is assigned to Trinity College and other selected individuals, but this is County Londonderry, which was a separate particular type of plantation. So again, just a summary, just to continue to give you a bit more context. Phillips is holding in Coleraine are taken over by the Crown, and he gets Limavady in return, or rather he gets granted lands at Limavady and what had been a Cahan's old castle. In 1613, royal charters were granted by the Crown to the Honourable the Irish Society. We'll talk a bit more about them in a minute. Coleraine and Derry. Another 37 towns did get royal charters, but this was about James needing to hold elections in Ireland to raise taxes. So he was giving these other royal charters to make sure he had Protestant representatives down in Dublin to ensure that he could get his tax rises through. It's those first three royal charters that are the significant ones. In 1620, you have MacDonald being created the Earl of Antrim. In 1639, you have the Star Chamber crisis, which I'll talk a little bit more again. Charters were removed and the lands were given back to the companies. The 1641 and 42, we had the rebellion. 1662, Charles II reinstates all the charters. And then by 1689, we're into the Siege of Derry. So that is just a very brief timeline and to put things in context. So then in the early 17th century, James's treasury was empty. He needed new ships. They feared a Catholic invasion using Ireland. Ulster itself was wild and unruly. It was so far from Dublin, and it, along with the rest of Ireland, essentially ruined after the 9 Years' War. So MacDonald, shrewd politician that he was and remained, I should say, had switched sides when he sort of saw what was happening with the 9 Years' War. He did remain a Catholic, however, but he was rewarded with over 330,000 acres at a time when others were only getting up to 2,000 or 3,000 acres. And this was a source of deep distrust and jealousy with some of the other landowners like Chichester. There is a lovely quote that there is not a more cancred or malicious person than Sir Randall MacDonald, who from a beggar is made great and yet rests unthankful. And that's Sir Arthur Chichester in 1606. Now Chichester may be even more embittered towards MacDonald, partly because MacDonald supposedly killed his brother during the 9 Years' War. So perhaps justifiable that he wasn't too fond of MacDonald, but it was the wealth and the power that MacDonald retained. James himself was keen to use the Virginia model of plantation. There was one servitor, to use that word, or the one who took him up on his offer was Phillips, and he would buy some of the lands at Coleraine to start planting them. But because of the lack of uptake by other individuals like himself, he actually would encourage the king to approach the London companies as investors in the venture. And to that end, he would facilitated inspections, and he actually drew up what he called the Project of Plantation. The City of London at that time was governed by a common council and made up of representatives of the great medieval guilds of crafts or trades. They're known as livery companies. There are 55 of them at that time, but there were 12 what are called the great livery companies, and they're the ones whose names we see throughout our landscape. They were the mercers, the cloth workers, the goldsmiths, drapers, fishmongers, skinners, merchant tailors, haberdashers, salters, vintners, ironmongers, and grocers. They were and many remain very powerful and wealthy. You only have to look at somewhere like the Goldsmith College. James was counting on them to help him with his plantation. However, they were already investing in the Virginia plantation, and they were very reluctant to extend themselves further. And you'll see this quote here from Professor James Curl, whose books are well worth reading to find out more particularly about the City of London and the London companies. It was only when several respectable citizens had been jailed, fined, and further threatened that the city knew it had no chance of avoiding the will of the Crown. And the City of London was obliged to commit its resources and ingenuity to carrying out colonisation of part of the territory. They reluctantly agreed to invest, but the competition for their funds for Ulster put pressure on that young colony in Virginia. So this project of plantation, why were they doing it? Why were they convinced, if you like, to actually invest? Well, there were great forests along the Bann. You wouldn't know it today, but there was enormous opportunity there to replenish their ships and also carry out the building works that the companies and the Irish Society were obliged to carry out. There was rich agricultural land near Coleraine and Derry, which meant that they could support what would be these new towns, these new centres for the city to manage the plantation. And the big attraction, this is really what swung them, was the value of the fish in the rivers, particularly in the Bann and the Foyle. For centuries, private individuals, the church, and more recently, MacDonald had all claimed interests. So by 1609, and this is a map that I suppose I do refer to quite a lot because it sort of highlighted to me the fact that we had an opportunity here in Causeway to look at the two different sorts of plantation and to be inclusive with our history, because one of the challenges I certainly faced at the time was I was working across all four councils, and whilst Limavady and Coleraine were County Londonderry, there was almost a sort of perception that nothing really was happening in County Antrim. So what has the plantation got to do with us? Now, I'd like to think we have maybe, between the work we've been doing with our partners, that has changed. I think people are more aware of that history. But you can see there's very little in County Antrim. It's all happening here in County Londonderry. I'm sure the McDonalds would have a different view of that, and we'll hear a little bit about that, because MacDonald was already using the plantation model to settle his land and develop a town at Dan and Luce. He wanted to compete with the towns of the Londonderry plantation. He thought this was a really good idea, particularly Coleraine. We'll come back to Dunluce a bit later. In 1609, articles were drawn up for what would be the Londonderry plantation. As inspectors had gone over from the city. Phillips had been very kind in showing them around, but he was, I believe, fairly selective in what he showed them. Nothing much changes. The 16th century county of Coleraine, which extended from the River Bann across to Loch Foyle, would be increased with Derry and its liberties, and Coleraine, which is on the eastern side of the Bann, with 3,000. Actually, I'll come to that. Coleraine, there were sort of options there. The articles allowed that Coleraine could be built on the Abbey, or would be built on the Abbey side. With 100 houses, they had to build 100 houses and leave room for another 200. Plus, there would be 1,000 acres on the Abbey side. And if they were to build a bridge, because at this time the bridge had been destroyed, then they would have 2,000 acres on the other side. However, if the bridge wasn't going to be built, there would 3,000 acres would be on the Abbey side. Reports from the inspectors from the city who'd come over didn't think the west side was particularly viable, so the bridge was never going to be built, at least not in this period. It was much later and towards the end of the 17th century. So this meant that Phillips would be bought out of his lands at Coleraine. He'd been working away with the Abbey and developing the site. He was given land at Limavady, 3,000 acres, where he would get stuck in and start developing very rapidly Newtown, Limavady. The new liberties for Coleraine actually had to be negotiated with MacDonald. The plan would see the new county divided up by the 12 great livery companies, and you can see them here. You've got cloth workers here, you've got merchant tailors here, the ironmongers, whose manor house has a lovely name of Lizard Manor because that's what on one of their crests is the salamander. You have the mercers around Coleraine and Kilray, and we'll talk about Movanagher, vintners. We have the skinners over around Dungiven, the wonderful fishmongers at Ballykelly. Sir Thomas Phillips, you can see the extent of his lands there. Haberdashers, the cloth workers. They got their portions by lottery. The mercers over here at Movanagher and Kilray got arguably the best proportion. I said their holding with its forests and its river access. The skinners, who are up here in Dungiven, up in the mountains, found their proportions had quite a bit of poor quality upland. In addition to that, a lot of these proportions include parcels of land that were held by the church, the so-called deserving Irish, and those called servitors, the military or civic individuals such as Phillips, who had been rewarded for their service during the 9-Year War with land. And as I mentioned before, royal charters were granted to the Honourable Irish Society for their parcel of land over here and around Derry. Just as a matter of interest, other places that got their charter at that time were Belfast, Limavady, Lisbon, Clonakilty, and Sligo. Now, the instructions to the companies, and it was also for the Irish Society as well, although the scale of what they had to do was different. You must build a fortified house. You must build houses in what was called the English style, which is a cagework style, and I'll show you some examples of that. If there wasn't a church in your holding, you had to build one, and if it was there, it had to be the use of the established church. You must have enough settlers on the land who had to speak English, attend church, i.e. the established church. They must follow English customs and English laws. And the native Irish were not to be part of the new society, and nor were Presbyterians. The native Irish, I want you to just sort of remember that phrase because it's often held to be the case, whereas evidence from the archives, from the archaeology, challenge that. Coleraines Charter, which was awarded in 1613, but they had to have several drafts of it. Apparently the Coleraine ones didn't like the first draft because they thought it was too dairy focused. And again, I would say not a lot has changed. So Coleraine was to have a corporate body. The body was to be made up of the mayor, aldermen, and burgesses. Now change the name of burgesses to councillors, and you've got the same structure in our council today. Tristram Beresford, who was already the agent of the Honourable the Irish Society, was to be the first mayor of what was the council, or the town, the Common Council as it was called. He had to live in the town of Coleraine. He had to have a chamberlain, a recorder, a sword bearer, and 2 sergeants at mace, all very official. And here's another thing under the charter that resonates today. Coleraine was to hold a market on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays, and a 9-day fair once a year. There was to be a clerk to look after the market. And if you look at our Causeway Coast markets, you know, our council's right to hold those markets really dates back to this period. And these were ways of generating income for the Irish Society to send back to London and also to support its activities. The charter also allowed the town to send representatives to sit in Parliament. That's the same as the other charters. In order to practice your trade in the town as a member of the guild, you had to be a freeman. You could only become a freeman by invitation or by paying what they called a fine, and that fine was a monetary value in a silver spoon. I should say that the mayor was able to fine fellow councillors. I'm sorry, oh, that's all right, you're not seeing them. You just had a visitor. He was able to fine his fellow councillors for not coming to meetings, for not sweeping in front of their houses on a Saturday. So I'm just going to go on into some details of some of the sites. Now, we are hopeful that we're going to be able to take you on some tours of these sites, because it's really only when you get out into these landscapes, and this has proved invaluable for us in terms of trying to get the message across about the different histories that we have in this area. Get out into that landscape and explore it with the archaeologists and the historians. So I'm going to say a note of caution here. The maps I'm using are by a fellow called Thomas Ravens. He produced these in 1622. They were commissioned by Sir Thomas Phillips as part of his campaign against the companies from the get-go. As soon as he got his land holdings in Limavady, he was watching the companies and looking at what they were doing. He wasn't happy. They weren't doing it right. They weren't building enough. The Coleraine and Derry weren't being well enough built. And he obviously had enough clout, because certainly the City of London did ultimately listen to him. So some of the features do appear to be a little bit aspirational, or at least representing what should have been there. However, they do contain some extraordinary information that when they're combined with the archaeological evidence and some of the archives, we get a reasonably true picture. So you can see there, and this comes back to the charters, where the native Irish were not supposed to be settled on the land. Sir Thomas Phillips was formerly, if you like, you can see here in this quote, for the as he had for the convenience of the Londoners, quitted some portions of land at Coleraine. They, the Londoners, have assigned unto him Limavady, with 3,000 acres Irish measure adjoining. Irish measure is an important note, because a lot of the proportions were, because they were Irish acres, they were much bigger than the London companies expected. The English acre is smaller. As the lands he had parted with to the Londoners were for the most part inhabited by natives, the Lords think that his request is reasonable to have permitted to have the natives likewise on these lands, as other servers had. So there was a bit of an exception being made to some of the military men and civil servants, for want of a better word, where they were being granted lands. So already we're seeing a contradiction with the charter. What you can see here, I'm hoping it's not too dark. This is O'Cahon's castle, what remained of it, which he did use. He also built a manor house here, You can see the fortifications. Now, Professor Horning found evidence of an ornamental, the fish pond, the castle itself, which was important, possible brew house down here, and evidence of these agricultural buildings. I'm just going to move to the next slide. In Dungiven then, again, using the Ravens map from 1622, Dungiven was an ancient ecclesiastical site that had also been a stronghold of the O'Cahans and was garrisoned by the English when after 1603. And by 1609, we had a captain, later Sir Edward Dodington, holding the site. Now, it's 1609, the Skinners were granted these lands, so he was compelled to surrender his interests to the Skinner Company. But they kept him as an agent for their proportion, so he remains there, but he dies in 1618. In 1619, though, his widow, a very formidable lady, and it's great to see that this wasn't all about the men, Lady Anne Beresford Doddington, by now cook, resides over a village of 12 houses in 1619. There is a lovely story that Nick Brannan tells about when she marries Cook, he looks to take over her now deceased husband's lands, including Dungiven. She wasn't having any of it. So they sort of struck a truce and agreed that whoever got back to Dungiven first from London would hold Dungiven. They set off separately. Cook pulls up to Dungiven only to see Lady Doddington Cook flying her flag, so she got to keep Dungiven. Now, the quality of this manor house, again, the archaeology would suggest it was very poor. The structure was not at all well built, but they did stint on the decoration, and it would seem we have this tile. This is a replica tile from Dungiven. This was produced by the Northern Ireland Environment Agency at the time. We have a number of them in the collection. But Lady Anne Beresford Doddington Cook's sister was actually married to Phillips, and there's evidence that the two of them actually used the same plasterer, because a lot of the detailing that they have found in the archaeology was the same. But interestingly, again, it's coming back to this, who was doing the settling? Were they meeting their obligations? 1622, 1 British freeholder, 12 British men, 384 Irish on the Skinners proportion. So Phillips is ramping up his evidence. Now, Movanagher, over on the River Bann, slightly north of Kilrea. You can see on Raven's maps, all these trees are representing some of the great forests that were along the River Bann. In 1622, Raven's recording that there were 3 freeholders, 52 British men, and 142 Irish on the proportion. If anybody knows Movanagher, the remains of the Bourne are on a private property. We do get permission to take tours there from time to time. This flanker still exists. There is the remains of that one. Where the old manor house was is now a modern farmyard with a new house. But the landscape's still quite extraordinary as you walk around the fields, but please, it is only by permission of the property owner. You can see what is the old mill down there, because they were stripping the forests out. And to some extent, those forests were certainly in Movanagher, by the time of the 1641-42 rebellion, those forests were long gone. What you can see, when I mentioned that they were to build English style houses, you can see them very clearly, these cage work houses here. But this is what really got Audrey Horning interested in this site, and where she did spend some considerable time excavating. By using these maps as a basis, she was able to excavate the hearth, and she found the remains of those traditional houses, as well as a mix of Irish and English ceramics, which indicated that there was day-to-day interaction between the British and the native Irish. The settlement was certainly burned in 1641-42 rebellion, and with the forest being stripped bare, the Mercers then would decide to move their base to Kilrea, and you can still see evidence of their involvement there. I'm just going to mention Goodlands. I don't have a map. This is near Ballycastle, above, on a headland above Murlock Bay, another site that Audrey excavated. It's 12 miles from the Mullockentire, and there were 100 houses. And her archaeological excavations led to a reinterpretation. The site was in fact settled by Roman Catholic Scots from Islay under MacDonald in the late 16th, early century. So it's additional evidence of what MacDonald is up to with his plantation. Now, Dunluce. This is one of the sites we do, Colin Breen does take people to on our tours. This illustration, was done with Philip Armstrong, who's an archaeological illustrator. In a minute, I'm going to show you one of Coleraine, and he works very closely with the archaeologists to best represent these settlements as we know them. And they're just a great way of bringing these places to life. Colin would, a statement by Colin would be that it was laid out by MacDonald to rival the town set up by the London companies. This was a highly significant attempt by MacDonald in the early 17th century to mimic the work of the formal plantation. By 1611, he'd established his plantation town with the intention of actually competing with Coleraine. But we all know Dunluce. There's no harbour. And this really was the big flaw in his plan. The town would actually only last 25 years. It was burned by the rebelling Irish in 1641-42. We have found evidence that Sir Thomas Phillips, Portrush actually was part of MacDonald's lands. When Sir Thomas Phillips was in holding Coleraine, he leased Portrush Harbour from MacDonald for we believe a barrel of wine was the rent he had to pay. And obviously that went down well. Colin, during his excavations, and he did some community archaeology projects with groups around the area, and I don't know that I've seen any names of people who were involved with that. Colin and his team were discovering the remains of that town, particularly a Scottish merchant's house. He also found an extraordinary cobbled street, which is still exposed when you go to the site today. They have deliberately left that open. And one of the participants discovered a 16th century coin. And his just excitement at finding that coin, and he referred to the fact that this is something that somebody has, archaeologists, that's their bread and butter. But this was somebody who was coming onto the dig for a first time, never done anything like this before. And for him to touch something, as he said, that was 400 years old, his were the first hands to touch that in 400 years, I think still sits with him today. Bearing Dunluce in mind, and you can see the sort of the square, some of the street patterns are not dissimilar to what we have today. But when we come to Coleraine, and I do know more about Coleraine because of the emphasis of the work we did 10 years ago, so forgive me, I could talk for a long time on this, so you might want me to be quiet after a while. So anyway, thanks to Philip Armstrong and working with Nick Brannan, they just were able to give us this visual representation of Coleraine. You can see here, this is the abbey that I referred to, that Sir Thomas Phillips would build next to, and we suspect he may have used some of the stones, given the state of the abbey at this stage, for his house, for his manor house. You can see that's what we know as Bridge Street today. And I suppose Lisa did tell me there's a few of you who do come from around Coleraine, so you just have to forgive me if I do go on a bit more. And it is because of the London Company records. We'd had some extraordinary opportunity to get over into those archives, scratching the surface. What they did find was that later excavations, a fellow called Paul Lowe dug the Baptist church site in Coleraine, and they found that the fortified town that the London companies built over Coleraine They used the sort of medieval street layouts as their guide, but in actual fact, the evidence that Paul found indicated that the gardens of that medieval town extended beyond the fortifications. But as you walk around Coleraine today, you are walking the streets of 17th century Coleraine and earlier. You can see the market square there. Interesting. I'm just going to go on to this next map. This was Phillips's map of Coleraine in 1622. I don't know whether you can see the detail there, but there's a bridge. There never was one, certainly not at this time, and there's been no evidence for it. Again, something to sort of perhaps beat the Irish Society up about. Nick has gone looking for the bridge in his excavations, but all he's found are these jetties. And you can see the ships would be pulling up at those jetties, coming up the river Bann when tide permitted. When the tide didn't permit, or the bar mouth was dangerous, they would actually head off to Portrush. Portrush, sorry. Coleraine is on a hill, it rises up. So putting a moat to defend this fortification, which was earthen ramparts. If you look at Derry is stone, much easier to defend. These earthen ramparts were approximately 8 foot tall, but they are climbing up a hill. The moat had to have dams to keep the water in it, but that meant in times of trouble, people could use those as ways to get across, and there were only ever 2 gates. At one stage there were meant to be 3. They never built as many houses as they were supposed to. However, by 1630, they would build a fortified citadel in this area here. Nick again found the evidence for that. You can see the logs being brought down the river from places like Movanagher. In 1637, despite all the problems with navigating the bar mouth, there's a wonderful set of port records book from 1613 that records all the goods that were going in and out of the town. So you were getting things like very fine silks, wine, tobacco, laces, spices, dried fruit and sugar coming in from Scotland, England and France. And they were exporting, of course, the salmon, the beef, sheepskins, tallow, oats, barrels and pipe staves and tanned leathers. So they were rending those logs in and around this area here. Nick did find in one of his piles of rubbish, as he talked about from the early 17th century, some very, very fine pieces of Venetian glass. So despite some of the crudities of the times when there were no sewers, I'm just going to move to this next slide. Some of you may have heard of the Book of Coleraine, which is a 19th century version of the town, but some of these buildings that date from plantation period were still in existence right up until the 20th century. But when I talked very early on, I showed you that photograph of Nick's with the piece of timber still in the side of Moore's building. It is these little colonnades that stepped out into, this is Market Street, which is where the diamond is. And it just allowed people to move above the filth of the streets, because this is where you had the big beast markets in all these towns. So the streets were not clean by any means. So in terms of, just to give you a bit of a sense of the people, these illustrations come from a wonderful map by John Speed, who produced this in 1610 of the whole of Ireland. But it's these little illustrations that are little gems showing a gentleman and a gentlewoman of Ireland, in other words, the lords and ladies, the civil Irish woman and Irish man, and then what they were called the wild Irish man and woman, not totally savages at all. These are just a few of the artifacts that we have. We're not some of the sort of traces of people that we have, sometimes in our collection, sometimes in our landscape, which I haven't just referenced there. The Camac 1610 is a grave in the Old Church graveyard in Ballymoney. This rather interesting looking object is part of 3 garments, a doublet, a pair of trousers and a cloak that were found in a field outside of Dungiven. It's called the Dungiven costume, no great surprise. It's down in the National Museum of Northern Ireland. There's been a lot of work looking at its structure, and it turns out that it's a set of clothes of very different ages. There are lots of men's in it. So but they have been able to extract, they've made up a tartan from it, the Ulster tartan, and there is a replica in the Ulster Museum. So it gives a sense of the clothing. And this is the leather shoe found in 17th century Coleraine. You can still see the little needle holes. This is that Venetian glass, incredibly fragile. It is just wafer thin. Every time we put it on display, you just, draw breath and hope for the best. And that is what we think is a replica of a 17th century soldier's helmet. It's too light to be seriously protective, but we think it's a Victorian replica. Now, in terms of the Londonderry plantation, there were problems pretty much from the get-go. These companies, these great livery companies, were pretty much absentee landlords. So it's left up to their agents. And there were all sorts of claims of mismanagement and personal gain against these agents, not least John Rowland in Coleraine. He was accused of profiteering from the timber. Didn't all make, or the profits from the timber didn't make its way back to the Honourable the Irish Society of the London Companies. And this would continue right through the 17th century. It wasn't just Sir Thomas Phillips. The Irish acres, as I mentioned before, were much bigger than the English acres, which meant they not only failed to get enough settlers, but they hadn't calculated how many they would actually need. The companies had actually invested very heavily, but the returns were poor. The proportions themselves, those holdings weren't single parcels of land. And I'm just, that map at the bottom shows you the Mercer's proportion. Apologies, that keeps a bit too sensitive for my liking. You can see Movanagher. Now, Kilray is in an interesting position as we would know it today, but you've got the church lands up in Kilray. You've got the freehold of Manus Cabala O'Cahan, which is around Garva. And there would have been other small holdings as well. So it meant that they were hard to defend if they needed to defend them. And they weren't just able to manage them quite as well with all those interruptions. Sir Thomas Phillips is repeatedly sending complaints back to the city, not least the 1622 maps that he had Ravens do for him. This led to an event called the Star Chamber Crisis, which saw the charters of the companies revoked and their lands were seized briefly. They got their lands back, but it actually wasn't till I had the date earlier and it's gone completely out of my mind, that they get it back, the charters much later. So in 1641-42, the rebellion would see Movanagher destroyed, and as I mentioned, they moved up into Kilray. Dunluce itself was burnt, the town, and that was the end of it. Coleraine was under siege. It survived it, as did Derry. The forests are gone by the 18th century completely. Today, however, the Irish Society are still here. MacDonald is still here. They are landowners. You'll still see them on various leases. The fishing rights to the ban. If you want to get your license to fish in the river ban, including the Ballymoney River, I believe, you will be getting that license from an agent of the Honourable the Irish Society. It is now a charity and it's based at Cutts House in Coleraine. It still owns the Walls of Derry. The Earl of Antrim is based still at Glen Castle, and of course Dunluce is that iconic tourist attraction. The place names across the Causeway Coast and Glens area resonate with this period, and our council, of course, can trace its origins back there. On the right is the picture of the Mayor's Chain, 1926, that was presented to the then new borough of Coleraine. The mayor today still wears it, and you can see the arms of the Honourable Society, Shamrock at the top, arms of the Irish Society, the Red Hand of Ulster, the George Cross, and these wee beasties at the side are from the arms of the City of London, and that's the Honourable the Irish Society crest. And those of you who may remember Coleraine Borough Council will remember we used to have those beasties at the side of Coleraines as well. I kind of miss them, only because they're such fantastical beasts. If you're looking for more information, we were lucky. I mean, the London Metropolitan Archives does have an inventory online of the Irish Society archive, but it's not, you see box, it's like a box of papers from 1616 to 1847, for instance. They're not digitized. The one thing that has been digitized more recently is what's called the Great Parchment Book. This was affectionately known as the Great Papadam Book. It got caught up in the Guild Fire in 1786. A number of the Irish Society records got destroyed, which is why we don't have a copy of Coleraines' original charter, for instance. Prony has a record of Limavady's charter. But they have done a lot of work conserving this Great Parchment Book, and there is a fantastic website where they have not only, you can actually see these original artifacts, and they have done a lot of work conserving them, remoisturizing them, but they are also transcribed and then translated, because reading the script from the 17th century, I can't, and a lot of people can't. We were lucky enough to have somebody working with us who could, but there's also, it's an absolutely extraordinary archive of information. The Irish Society themselves, they have some information on their website. Each of those big London companies have their own archives. They're not the easiest to get into, but I mean, we actually sort of went in through the Irish Society to get access to some of the material. The 1641 depositions, where we start to get the voices of people coming through from the rebellion. They are available online as well. And then all the work we've been doing over the years is available on our website at WWNI Archive. We are currently working with Corrie Mealer, Professor Horning, Dr. Colin Breen, and Belfast City Council and Corto on a new lottery project, which is called Our Places, Our Pasts and Our Perspectives, which is building on this history. And there are two strands, working with community groups and their own histories of their place, using our places like Dunluce, Coleraine, Movanagher and Dungiven as examples. And then we've also got a separate strand, which is training people who are interested in working in contested history and running projects that deal with contested history. And it's about the confidence building of those people, practitioners. I'm going to stop there. I'm feeling a bit thirsty. I'm just going to have a mouthful of tea. I'm not.
Okay, Helen, I've got quite a few questions. So if you stop sharing your screen, we'll see it all everybody pop up again, and I'll start asking the questions that have been put onto the chat. So the first one, well, Harry has mentioned that he went to the Irish Society School in Coleraine, and he also asks about the map showing Northeast Ireland and the Scottish coast, and is wondering where he can get a reproduction of that.
He can, sorry, I'm just having a minor blip as to how to get rid of the sharing screen, so apologies. I find because this period is just so complicated, I worry that I'm not being clear enough. So, right, we're now back. So sorry, Harry. Yes, that map, it's from the National Maritime Museum. So it would be to contact them. If you're just looking to have a look at it, certainly Colin's book on the McDonald's has it, and we do have a version of it up on the archive, but we do not have copyright permission. We have copyright permission to have it up on the archive. We don't have copyright permission to print it, reproduce it for you.
Okay. I thought I'd just share this. You mentioned this.
Yes, I do recognise that.
This came from a bin lorry originally.
Yes, we actually have one very much like it in our collection as well. And I nearly had the photograph up for you, but I sort of had to deselect a few of the images. So yes, it happened to far too much of our history. Too many archives, too many objects have ended up in skips. So thank you for rescuing it.
Okay. So Margaret has said that she lived in Portstewart up until a few months ago, and she's asking, is the chalice used for the Eucharist in St. Patrick's?
Ooh. Pass on that one. I haven't attended a service in St. Patrick's for a long time. So I think it's probably, we could certainly find out, just you can contact St. Patrick's and ask them. I do know it's kept very safely. And we were able to borrow it for a collection. Whether they've still got it in daily use, I'm not sure.
Okay. So Timothy Plum was saying that he is joining us from Virginia, which is interesting because of the content of the talk as well, Helen.
Great.
Okay. So Bonnie was asking, how is Londonderry Plantation different from the others? And Nick had popped in a quick message to say that it was granted to a corporation made up of London commercial guilds or companies. So is there anything to add to that makes it different?
Yeah, the Londonderry Plantation was the City of London. It was their plantation, okay. Whereas the other ones were given to individuals. Some of that, they all have different, they call them undertakers. Some of them were undertakers, some of them were servitors. But they were by individuals, and they were different depending on the level they were at in terms of their merit. They had different conditions of their charter, but the Londonderry Plantation was by the City of London, those great livery companies, and then they set up the Honourable the Irish Society to manage their interests. Okay. I'm hoping that's clear. Absolutely. If it's not, come back to me.
That's okay. Bonnie's also asking, what is the size of an Irish acre?
Oh, flip. There's always one question. That is a fact, I'm sorry, has slipped, and I will get that for you and come back to you.
That's okay. That's interesting that there's a difference.
There's actually, one of the maps we have is, it's actually an earlier one by Raven, and it's of the Merchant Taylor's lands, and he actually has his inches, and he's got Irish inches and English inches. There's not a lot of difference in them, but it's enough that when it's a cumulative thing, it adds up. But I will get back to you on that one, and Lisa, I will.
Okay, no bother. So Joanne has sent a few questions. She asked about the term freeman. What does that mean?
Sorry, what was that?
Freeman.
Freeman.
Huh?
Yeah, that is, you were a freeman of the town, and you were a freeman, which meant you were a member of the guild, one of the livery companies, sorry, and you had to pay your fine. Certainly with Coleraine, you had to pay a fine and a silver spoon to become a freeman. You were nominated.
So it's a status. Okay, and she asked as well, what is the story of the name of Londonderry?
Derry was called Derry, but under the plantation, they wanted to, because it was County Londonderry was the new county, but because of the city of Derry, they wanted to add the name London onto it. So it's now it was being called Londonderry at the time, but of course in recent times we've seen it change to Londonderry stroke Derry or Derry stroke Londonderry, but it is County Londonderry.
Okay. Again, she's asking what's a freeholder?
Freeholder is, just apologies. The freeholder is somebody who, the freehold of the land. Sorry, my memory's just gone on that one.
You're all right, Helen. I'm grilling you here with all these questions. We can come back to any of them. Absolutely.
Was that not my definitions? Probably not.
No,
I didn't want to weigh you down with definitions.
Well, of course, there's a lot of information in there. Helen, the next question is why the Native Irish were not part of the new society, and did that include Presbyterians?
The Irish, the Native Irish were considered, they called them the wild kern. They were considered like it, the London companies were coming into what they saw as empty land, for want of a better word, and that anybody was there was wild and unruly and uneducated. And that's putting it very simply. We do know that there were some, as I mentioned, the deserving Irish who had served the crown. So they weren't all, but it was the native Irish that were not included. They weren't welcome. Under the rules of the Charter, we see the evidence that would indicate that actually the London companies needed them to pay the rents and help them settle the land. So.
Okay, and I see Tess Malloy in the chat there has given us the answer. 3 Irish acres equals roughly 5 English acres.
Brilliant.
There you go.
Thanks
you for that,
Bonnie.
Tess. That's brilliant. Okay. So Harry is mentioning the Crockett family at Movanagher. Movanagher.
Yep.
And he believes they're related to Davy Crockett, who died in the Battle of Alamo. Do you know about that?
No, I pass.
Did you know about the Crockett family connection?
Yes, I know about the Crockett's at Movanagher. Yes.
It was the farmer himself, I think, that told me that connection.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, so I think that's true.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just wary of mentioning names. It is private property, and we don't want people plaguing them to get onto the land. So.
Yeah. Is it quite derelict now, or is somebody maintaining it?
It's on private property. It's still there, but there's like a tree growing up through the flanker.
Right. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna. I've still got more questions here, but if we don't get through all of these tonight, I can email them through to Helen, and
yeah,
and
absolutely.
we can send
Yeah,
back.
given the way my memory's going now.
At all. So Julie Short is asking, how would they have attracted people to come and settle in Coleraine?
The people in Coleraine were coming in. The London companies were bringing in settlers, so they were offering them opportunity, the land of opportunity. Now, some of where you get, oh no, I'm not going to go there because that's just going to make it even more complicated. But those in Coleraine tended to be agents, members of the livery companies, like as we were talking about the freemen. So it was more, the challenge was getting the settlers out in on the estates, and that's where they ran into problems. They just, they brought in some Welsh as well, trying to attract them as, you could make money, The same argument they were using with the London companies themselves, that there was an opportunity here. Okay. It's just a lot harder.
Okay, so maybe take one more question, Helen, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I've been asked here if farmers could have their own land at that time, and or really, what happened to the people that weren't living on the plantation ground?
Well, they would have been the people living in County Londonderry were either tenants, and they would be paying rents back to the London companies. And this is where some of, oh, I just saw a notice, did I drop out there?
No?
No. The Irish tenants were paying rents to the whoever held that proportion or that holding. So if it was, say that, I'm going to use the Mercers again, that if there was an Irish tenant on the land, they were paying much higher rents than the British tenants. And that sort of didn't help, that there was resentment against paying such high rents. Anybody who was not part of this, who shouldn't have been on there, like these so-called wild Irish, were living in the forests. They weren't landowners.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to give an opportunity for anybody that wants to ask a question verbally, because so far they've all been on the chat. So is there anyone that wants to ask one final question?
Hello, Lisa. Hello, Helen, and everybody else. Very interesting talk, very well researched.
Hello, Miriam.
Couple of wee points. The coin that was found at Dunluce was in fact found by Ellen Donnelly from Ballintoy. We were invited as part of the Ballintoy History Group to take part.
Right. Yep.
That's number one. And Harry, an ex-Tyrone person like myself, would say that Davy Crockett's family were supposed to have come from Castlederg.
Oh, really? Okay.
So, duel at dawn then, okay?
It could be the same. Could be the same family, right? Yeah.
I would
think
imagine
this is
so.
one for Nick.
I would imagine so.
Sorry, Nick.
Very good. Okay, well, listen, if you have any more questions, please email them to me. I know that Professor Harlow there has asked a wee bit about a bibliography in the chat in terms of the areas that she's interested in, and quite a lot of studies mentioned in the talk. So I'll forward that on to you, Helen.
Yeah, and I'll pull those together. Sorry, I just, again, depending on what people are interested in. Yeah,
absolutely.
But there's some really good work has been done. Not just by Nick and Colin and Audrey, but you know, you've got Moody and Professor Curl and Philip Robinson. Yeah, there's a long list.
a vast area. Okay, listen, thanks so much everybody for attending. Thanks so much, Helen, for that brilliant talk, and
Thank you.
so wide ranging. Thanks a million.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to all your questions.
Okay, I'll email through if there's anything else. Okay, and take care. We'll see you next week. Helen and Nick, could you just give us a quick outline of what's happening next week?
Thank you.
Yes, that will be our colleague Sarah Carson is talking about Sam Henry, who was a prominent folklorist and musicologist, among many other things, a naturalist and antiquarian from the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century.
Perfect.
So she'll be talking about Sam and his collection that has been donated to Coleraine Museum.
Fantastic, thanks, Nick. Okay, so hopefully we'll see you for that. Thanks a million, folks, for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Thank
take care,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thank you, Lisa.
Bye, Naresh.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, Nye.
Thanks a million. Take care,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, Naresh. Bye, everybody.
Bye.